The house was old, older than any place they had lived before. It had been standing for over a century, weathering storms and years, its rough stone walls worn but sturdy. It was the kind of house with character, with a past. The kind that had seen generations come and go, its history etched into every uneven surface, every creaky floorboard. She liked it. That was what she told herself. It had charm, an odd, almost stately presence that set it apart from the soulless modern homes in their last neighborhood. The walls were thick, textured beneath her fingertips, cool and unyielding. The air smelled faintly of old wood and damp stone, a scent that seemed to have seeped into the very foundation of the place. There was something comforting about it at first. She spent the first days unpacking, arranging, making the house theirs. The children ran through the halls, their laughter echoing off high ceilings. Her husband carried in boxes, muttering about the steep staircase, about the strangely shaped rooms that didn't quite fit together the way they should. The architecture was odd. Hallways that ended in sharp corners, doors that didn't quite align properly when shut. A house that had been expanded upon, altered over time, but never quite made whole. At night, when everyone had gone to bed, she would linger downstairs. The kitchen was spacious, with dark wooden cabinets and a deep farmhouse sink. She would finish washing dishes, wiping the counters, letting the warmth of routine settle over her. And then, with everything in order, she would pour herself a glass of wine, leaning against the counter, watching the moonlight spill in through the tall windows. That was the time she cherished most, those quiet, stolen moments when the house was at rest. When the only sounds were the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway and the distant hum of crickets outside. But that first night, as she stood there, savoring the rich, dark taste of her drink, she heard it. A sound, so faint she almost missed it. A rustling deep within the walls. It was soft, irregular, like tiny claws scraping against wood. A mouse, she thought, or maybe a squirrel, nesting in the insulation. Nothing unusual for an old house like this. She listened for a moment, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. It came in starts and stops, a whisper of movement beneath layers of stone and plaster. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ceased. The silence pressed in, heavier than before. She set her glass down, shaking her head. Of course there would be mice. It was an old house, after all. The next morning, she mentioned it to her husband in passing. He barely acknowledged it, too preoccupied with fixing a loose hinge on one of the kitchen cabinets. Pests were inevitable in a house like this, he said. They would set traps. It would be fine. And for a while it was... But the rustling never really stopped. Some nights she would hear it again, always when the house was quietest. It wasn't constant, just fleeting, sporadic. Sometimes it sounded close, just behind the wall where she stood. Other times it was further away, buried deep within the house's structure. Then it changed. The soft scratches became something else. A sound so low, so faint, she couldn't quite place it. Like whispers just below the threshold of understanding. She would catch it when she was alone in the kitchen, or late at night when she passed the hallway near the stairs. A breathy, rustling murmur, like voices speaking too softly to be heard. The moment she turned her head, straining to catch a word, it would stop. She started to feel ridiculous. She wasn't the type to get spooked by an old house. It was just in her head. The acoustics of the place, carrying sounds strangely through the thick walls. But the atmosphere had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. Daniel, her youngest, started having trouble sleeping. He had always been the deep sleeper, the one who rarely stirred once tucked in. But now he would wake, bleary-eyed, rubbing at his face, complaining about bad dreams. She asked him what kind of dreams, but he only shrugged, unwilling or unable to explain. His room was one of the smaller ones, nestled at the end of the hall. The air always seemed cooler in there, the shadows darker. She caught him more than once staring at the wall near his bed, his small brow furrowed. One night, she found him standing in the hallway, his bare feet on the cold wooden floor, his pajamas rumpled. He looked disoriented, uncertain. When she asked what was wrong, he wouldn't answer right away. Just stood there, blinking as if shaking off a daze. Finally, he said he thought he heard something. something in the walls. Her stomach knotted, but she forced a smile, ruffled his hair. The house was old, she told him. Old houses made noises. The pipes, the wind, the wood shifting with the temperature. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. As she tucked him back into bed, she caught herself glancing at the wall. The rough surface, the uneven patches where old repairs had been made. She placed a hand against it, feeling the cool solidity beneath her fingertips. For a moment, she thought she felt something. A vibration, a pulse. She pulled her hand away. The house settled around her with a soft creak, the kind of sound that could be easily explained away. But the sensation lingered, trailing up her spine like cold fingers. The next night, she stayed up later than usual. Not intentionally. She simply found herself lingering, feeling reluctant to go to bed. The house was silent, the children asleep, her husband upstairs, already lost in dreams. She let the quiet wrap around her, listening. No rustling, no whispers, but the shadows. They stretched differently than they should. The light from the kitchen window cast them long and thin, but some reached too far, bending at odd angles. A trick of the eye. And yet, she turned away, shaking off the thought. The house was old. The walls were thick. Everything had an explanation. But as she made her way upstairs, she could have sworn, just before she rounded the corner, she heard her name, not spoken aloud, not in a voice she recognized, but a whisper, soft, breathless, from deep within the walls. She stopped, heart pounding, listened. Nothing, just the stillness of the house, vast and quiet in the dark. She climbed the rest of the stairs quickly, feeling suddenly exposed, as though something unseen was watching. By the time she reached her bedroom, the whisper was gone. But she knew, deep down, in that part of the mind that senses danger before reason catches up, it had been real, and whatever was inside the walls of their new home. It knew her name. The house had a rhythm now, a pattern of noises she had learned to ignore. The creak of the stairs when stepped on a certain way, the subtle groan of wood expanding and contracting with the change in temperature, the distant hum of pipes shifting inside the walls, and, of course, the rustling. At first, it had remained an occasional occurrence, something she only noticed in the quiet moments of the night. But then it changed. It was no longer just a soft, skittering movement of unseen creatures. It had evolved into something more deliberate, a sound that did not belong. Knocks, not loud, not aggressive, but there, always in odd sequences, 3 soft raps, then 4, then a long, patient pause. A pattern repeated with unsettling precision. She tried to rationalize it. Old pipes, maybe. Some natural shifting within the house's ancient structure. Until the night she heard her name. It was barely a whisper, barely more than the sound of breath against stone. She had been walking past the stairwell, fingers trailing absent-mindedly along the rough, uneven surface of the wall when it came. A faint, elongated sigh, curling through the air like smoke. Not spoken, not imagined, just there. Her blood went cold. Her first instinct was to freeze, to listen, but the silence that followed was almost worse. The weight of it pressed against her chest, making her breath shallow. The house did not feel empty. Slowly, cautiously, she pressed her palm to the wall. The coarse texture bit into her skin. She could feel a faint vibration, not movement, not sound, just a presence buried deep within. Something shifted. The sensation was minute but unmistakable. A slow, dragging motion just beneath the surface, like fingers tracing a path on the other side of the stone. She yanked her hand away. She barely remembered hurrying upstairs, barely remembered slipping beneath the blankets beside her sleeping husband. She only knew that, for the first time since moving into the house, she was afraid of the dark. And yet, come morning, the fear seemed foolish. The daylight dulled the edges of her unease. By the time she was making breakfast, the memory of the whisper had already begun to erode into something uncertain. It was just her mind playing tricks on her. The house was old. Sounds carried differently in a house like this. That was all. Then Daniel started talking about his new friend. At first, she didn't think much of it. Children invented imaginary friends all the time. And Daniel, being the youngest, had always been the one to weave stories out of nothing. But the way he spoke about this friend unsettled her. It wasn't the casual, scattered way children usually described make-believe playmates. There was something oddly specific about it. His friend lived in the walls, he had said. His friend whispered to him at night. His friend knocked to let him know he was there. She smiled, laughed it off, but something about it lingered, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. Her husband, of course, found it amusing. Kids were strange. Kids had wild imaginations. But Daniel wasn't pretending. It became clearer over time. The way he would tilt his head, listening to something only he could hear. The way he would giggle softly in the dark, whispering back. One night, she caught him sitting up in bed, his small hand pressed against the wall. She watched, unseen, as he knocked lightly. 3 times, then 4, then a pause. She waited. The house was silent. Then, a reply. A series of muffled knocks, faint but distinct, coming from within the wall. She felt her breath stutter. Daniel smiled, pleased, and settled back down under the covers. She stood frozen in the doorway, the air thick around her. The silence stretched. Then, without thinking, she stepped into the room, pressing her own palm against the wall. It was cold, solid. Whatever was inside had already gone still. She did not sleep that night. The next day, she tried to ask Daniel more about his friend. His answers were vague, playful, as though she was missing the joke. He said his friend had always lived there. He said his friend was very small, but sometimes he stretched himself long and thin to move through the walls. He said his friend liked him very much. And then he asked something that sent a fresh wave of unease through her. He asked if he could go inside the walls too. She told him no. She told him there was no inside, that the walls were just walls. But he only tilted his head at her in that curious way children do when they know you're lying. That night, she checked the walls herself, knocked in different places, listening for hollowness. But the house remained silent. It wasn't until the evening Daniel disappeared that she understood just how wrong she had been. It started like any other night. Dinner, bedtime stories, lights out. Everything had been normal. Until morning came, and Daniel was gone. His bed was neatly made, the covers smooth, untouched. His pajamas were gone, but his shoes remained, lined up perfectly beside the door. The window was locked from the inside. The door had not been opened. She checked every room, calling his name, her voice rising in pitch. Her husband joined the search, his face dark with concern. Nothing. He wasn't in the house. Panic gripped her as they called the neighbors, then his school friends, asking if anyone had seen him. There was only confusion, uncertainty. No one had. They assumed, at first, that he must have gone to his friend's house. A sleepover, a simple miscommunication. But when they called, they were met with silence. Daniel had not come. He was nowhere. The police were called. The search began. Their home became a flurry of movement. Officers moving through the rooms, scanning the yard, asking questions that had no answers. Had they heard anything in the night? Had they seen anything strange? No. Just the walls. Just the whisper. Just the knocking. By the time night fell again, the house was empty. Her husband had gone with the officers, helping coordinate the search efforts. She was alone. Alone with the house. Alone with the silence. And then, a knock. 3. Then 4. Then a pause. She turned, slowly, her throat tightening. The sound was coming from the wall by the staircase. Soft, patient, and then a whisper. Close. Too close. She ran. The world had shrunk. It had narrowed into the tight, suffocating grip of missing posters, police radios, and the endless, desperate search for a boy who had vanished without a trace. The hours stretched into days. The neighborhood transformed into a restless, searching entity. Volunteers combing through yards, officers moving through the woods with flashlights, slicing through the dark. Strangers whispered, their voices hushed, waited with the same lingering question. Where had Daniel gone? The house, once unsettling in small, uncertain ways, became unbearable. It pressed in around them, heavy with silence, with a hollow absence that seeped into everything. His room remained untouched, exactly as they had left it the morning he disappeared. His toys sat abandoned in the corner, his small shoes still by the door. Nothing had been taken. No sign of forced entry. No evidence that he had left at all. And yet he was gone. The police scoured every possibility. They questioned neighbors, checked security cameras, searched every stretch of land within miles. And each passing day, the unspoken reality clawed its way to the surface. There was nothing to find. The mother moved through the house like a ghost, drifting between rooms, her ears straining for a sound that wasn't there. She barely registered the voices of officers, their clipped reassurances, their gently pressing questions. Had she noticed anything unusual? Had Daniel ever mentioned wanting to run away? No, of course not. She barely noticed her husband anymore. He moved mechanically, speaking in low, tired murmurs to the officers, rubbing his face as though trying to wipe away reality. The search consumed him. He hardly slept. She didn't sleep at all. The house changed. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift that could be blamed on exhaustion, on grief twisting the mind into seeing what wasn't there. The air grew colder, not just in the way old houses could be drafty, but deeper, as if the walls had soaked in ice. Even with the heat turned up, the chill never left. It clung to the floors, to the spaces beneath doors. Then came the whispers. They had always been there, just at the edge of hearing. But now, they moved closer. What had once been distant, a faint murmuring buried within the walls, became sharper. It slithered beneath the floorboards, curled into the corners of rooms. She was never fast enough. Whenever she turned, whenever she strained to listen, the whispers would stop. They would sink back into the house's bones, retreating just out of reach. But they were growing bolder. One night, as she sat in the living room, arms wrapped around herself, staring into nothing, she heard them again. Soft, almost playful. She turned her head, pulse thrumming in her ears. From the dark hallway leading to the staircase, the whisper came again. Closer. The house held its breath. A second passed, then another, then from deep within the walls. A knock. 3, then 4, then a pause. She clamped a hand over her mouth, choking back the cry rising in her throat. The knock came again, this time louder. Then something worse. The smell. It came suddenly, oozing into the air like an open wound. A thick, sickly sweet rot, clinging to the back of her throat, heavy and unbearable. It rolled through the house, settling deep, as if it had always been there. It was coming from the walls. She staggered to her feet, pressing a trembling hand to her nose, trying to block out the stench. It seeped through her skin, crawled into her lungs. And then, Daniel, his voice, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. Mom. The breath left her body. She turned toward the staircase, her legs unsteady beneath her. The whisper had not come from far away, not from some distant, unreachable place. It had come from the wall. Something thumped weakly against the other side. A frantic, desperate sound. Her chest constricted. Daniel. The voice came again, hoarse, pleading. She moved without thinking, her hands pressing against the rough surface of the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel it, the vibration of movement, something shifting, something real. The walls were thick, solid stone and plaster. But there, just beneath her hands, there was something else. A hollow space. Her fingers scraped against the surface, searching for any sign of a seam, any opening, any proof that what she was hearing wasn't just her mind breaking apart. The knocking came again, weaker this time. A whimper. A sobi. She tore herself away, stumbling back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She ran to wake her husband. The words tumbled from her lips in a frantic, half-coherent rush. She pulled at his arm, dragging him toward the staircase, toward the wall, toward the sound that was still echoing in her ears. But the moment they reached it, the house fell silent. The wall stood still, smooth and unbroken. No voice, no knocking, just cold stone. He looked at her, exhaustion heavy in his eyes, his face lined with something worse than disbelief. She pressed her hands to the wall again, desperate, pleading. It had been there. She had heard it. Daniel was here. He was inside. But her husband only shook his head. His voice was quiet, measured. He told her she was exhausted. That grief was making her hear things. That she hadn't slept in days. That she was breaking under the weight of it all. She wanted to scream. She wanted to shake him, to force him to hear what she had heard. But the house had already gone silent. The smell lingered, thick and cloying, sinking into the walls like decay. She knew what she had heard, and she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that her son was still inside this house. Somewhere. Trapped. Waiting. Her husband didn't believe her. The police didn't believe her. No one did. They continued searching elsewhere, far beyond the house, beyond the neighborhood, casting their nets wider, believing Daniel had slipped away, wandered off, had been taken by something outside. But she knew better. She knew where he was. The walls had swallowed him whole. The realization took hold like a sickness. She could not sleep, could not eat. Every waking moment was spent moving through the house, fingers tracing the uneven stone, nails scraping over its imperfections. She knocked, listening for anything, any hint of movement, any muffled sound buried within. Nothing. But she remembered the voice, the weak thumps. She had heard him. Somewhere beneath the thick, old stone, there was space. A place beyond what could be seen. And she would find it. Her nails chipped against the rough wall, her fingertips raw, bleeding as she worked. She followed instinct, dragging her hands along every surface near the staircase where she had last heard him. And then, finally, she felt it. A thin seam beneath her fingers. So faint, so subtle, nearly invisible beneath layers of uneven stone. But it was there, a section that was not quite flush with the rest. A door. Aidun passage. Her pulse pounded against her ribs as she staggered back, staring at it. It had been here the whole time. She ran to the kitchen, yanked open a drawer, wrapped her trembling fingers around a knife. Back at the wall, she wedged the blade into the seam, forcing it between the stones, prying, pulling. The resistance was stiff, unwilling, like the house itself did not want to give up its secret. Then, a crack, a deep, splintering shift. The wall moved. It gave way, stones scraping against stone, a sliver of darkness opening before her. A passage, narrow, suffocating, barely wide enough for a child to slip through. The smell struck her like a blow. Thick, rotten, a grotesque sweetness that clung to the air, clogging her throat. The scent of something long hidden, long forgotten. She gagged, staggering forward, one hand bracing against the rough opening, the other gripping the flashlight she had grabbed from the counter. Her breath came shallow as she angled the beam inside. The passage extended into blackness, vanishing beyond the reach of the light. The walls were rough, unfinished stone, damp with something that seeped from the cracks like sweat. She stepped forward, the stone pressed in around her, close and suffocating. The farther she crawled, the worse the smell became. The air felt wet, thick with decay, curling over her skin like fingers. Then she saw them. Scratches, lining the walls in frantic, erratic patterns. Some shallow, some deep enough to have splintered the stone. Small, desperate gouges from tiny, helpless hands. Something had tried to get out. Her stomach clenched. A few steps more, and she found the fabric. Scraps of cloth, wedged between the cracks. A small sock, dirted and torn. Her throat tightened as she reached down, picking it up with trembling fingers. She knew it. Daniel's. Her son had been here. Panic clawed at her chest as she pressed forward, breath coming in ragged gasps. The passage narrowed, forcing her to crawl. Her knees scraped against the cold, damp stone, hands sinking into the filth that caked the floor. Somewhere ahead, something moved, a soft, wet shift in the darkness. The beam of the flashlight flickered. The passage widened into a small, hidden chamber. And there, a figure, crouched in the farthest corner, motionless. Small, too thin, bones pushing against pale, dirt-smeared skin. A child, a breath hitched in her throat. She knew before he moved, before he lifted his head, slow, unnatural, the motion too smooth, too deliberate. The flashlight trembled in her grip, casting unsteady light across the chamber. Daniel, His clothes hung loose over his body, torn and stained, fabric clinging to sharp angles. His hair was matted, dark with something she could not name. But it was his face that stopped her. It was not right. His lips curled into something that should have been a smile, but wasn't. His teeth were too many. Rows upon rows, jagged and small, packed too tightly behind his lips. His eyes, not Daniel's, dark, endless, too wide. She could not breathe. The air thickened, congealing in her throat. He moved, not like a child, not like Daniel. His limbs stretched, elongated, shifting as if his body was learning how to fit into itself. A sound rose in the space between them. A low, breathy whisper, not spoken aloud, not heard in any normal way. Felt. It pressed into her skin, curled beneath her ribs, slid through the marrow of her bones. Something not meant for this world. Something wearing her son's face. She stumbled back. Her foot slipped on something soft. She did not look down. She did not want to see. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that stretched across the chamber walls, warping, twisting. And then he moved. Fast. Too fast. And he was smiling. Too many teeth. It moved toward her. A grotesque, scuttling thing, its too thin limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. The movement was jagged and uneven, as though learning how to use the body it inhabited. She couldn't breathe. Daniel, not Daniel, tilted its head, watching her with those two dark eyes, lips peeling back into that impossible grin. The stretch of its mouth was unnatural, splitting wider, as if the skin were struggling to contain what lay beneath. Then it giggled. The sound was high and breathy, echoing through the narrow passage. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. Her stomach turned. The thing's head twitched, jerking in small, unnatural spasms, like something used to the weight of its own skull. It took a step closer, the sound of bones scraping against stone. And behind it, she saw them. The bones, piled in the corners of the chamber, brittle and yellowed with time. Small, too small, child-sized, her throat locked. Some were nearly dust, disintegrated into the damp earth beneath her hands. Others were newer. Some still clung to the tatters of fabric. Fragments of shoes, scraps of color that had once been bright, now faded with decay. The chamber reeked of rot, of something long hidden, a place not meant to be found. She understood. Daniel had never left the house. He had never wandered away, never been taken by something outside. He had been here the whole time. Or rather, something else had taken his place. She wanted to scream. The thing in front of her crouched lower, its limbs folding awkwardly, the weight of its grin widening, stretching across two pale cheeks. Her son's face, but not her son. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her body screamed for movement, for escape. The thing giggled again. The sound was closer now, the weight of it pressing against her skull. It lunged. She threw herself backward, scrambling through the passage, her hands slipping against the wet, crumbling stone. The air was too thick, too suffocating. She could hear it behind her, the scrape of limbs, the skittering of something trying to follow. The passage seemed longer than before, a narrowing tunnel, closing in, walls pressing too tight. Her nails scraped against the stone. She reached the opening, gasping for breath, hands slamming against the edges as she forced herself through. The house swallowed her whole. The air was cold, too cold. She stumbled into the hallway, collapsing onto the wooden floor, the world spinning. Behind her, she heard movement, a rustling, a whisper, and then nothing. The passage was gone. She blinked, heart hammering, the weight of the knife still clutched in her trembling hand. The wall stood smooth, unbroken. No sound, no sign it had ever been anything but solid. She reached out, pressing her palm to the stone. Cold, lifeless. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. She turned, still gasping for air, still trying to make sense of the world spinning around her. Her husband's face swam into view, twisted with concern, his hands gripping her shoulders, shaking her. She tried to speak, to tell him, to warn him, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by the weight of something unseen. She turned back to the wall, her fingers running desperately over its surface, searching. Nothing, not even a crack, as if it had never existed at all. And then, a voice. Soft, warm, familiar. Her heart clenched. She turned. Daniel stood in the doorway. His pajamas were clean. His hair was neatly combed, his small hands resting at his sides. He looked perfect, whole, untouched. A smile curled his lips, sweet, innocent. His eyes met hers, shining with warmth, with something too knowing. He took a step closer, tilting his head in that gentle, curious way he always had. The room was silent. The whole house was silent. And then, he asked her why she was crying.